The crystal chandelier hanging over the 20-foot mahogany dining table at Pinecrest Estate hummed with a faint, high-frequency vibration. Outside, a bitter late November frost was setting over the rolling hills of Greenwich, Connecticut. Inside, the grand dining room smells of roasted turkey, sage stuffing, vintage Cabernet, and the suffocating perfume of old money arrogance. I sat near the far end of the table, squeezed between a decorative marble pillar and an ice bucket, seated on a plain wooden folding chair, while the rest of the family reclined on velvet-upholstered armchairs. At the head of the table sat my mother-in-law, Genevieve Sterling. Genevieve was 72, immaculate, dressed in a custom emerald green silk dress, her neck draped in 3 strands of antique Mikimoto pearls. Her sharp blue eyes swept over the 22 gathered guests, state politicians, hedge fund managers, and country club board members, before landing on me with absolute, unadulterated contempt. "Ladies and gentlemen," Genevieve announced, lifting her crystal champagne flute, her voice ringing out across the quieted room. "Before we carve the bird tonight, I want to express my deepest gratitude for the pure, unblemished legacy of the Sterling family. We are blessed with pedigree, distinction, and generational honor." She paused, turning her cold gaze directly toward my folding chair. "Now," Genevieve continued, her tone dropping into a loud, deliberate cadence that carried to every corner of the room. "As for that person sitting at the end of the table, the woman Richard brought into our home, I must remind everyone of the house rules for tonight's gathering. Under no circumstances is anyone to speak her name. We do not acknowledge cheap interlopers under this roof. If you require the salt, ask it to pass it. If you need a plate cleared, hand it to her." A suffocating hush descended upon the dining room. Several high society guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Beside me sat my husband of 3 years, Richard Sterling. Richard was wearing a tailored tuxedo, adjusting his gold cufflinks. He didn't look at me. He didn't slam his hand on the table. He didn't utter a single word in defense of his wife. Instead, he reached for his glass, took a nervous sip, and stared straight ahead into his dinner plate, completely paralyzed by cowardice. Genevieve offered a thin, cruel smile. "We do not pollute our family history by giving names to stray dogs we pick up from the gutter." I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I slowly set my silver linen napkin down beside my fork, looked Genevieve dead in the eyes, and maintained a flat, unreadable pulse. Before Genevieve could take another sip of her champagne, the deep, thunderous rumble of heavy diesel engines reverberated through the floorboards of the mansion. Outside, twin beams of high-intensity LED headlights sliced through the dark, icy fog of the long estate driveway. A massive, armor-plated black Suburban with dark-tinted windows, flanked by 2 federal escort vehicles with flashing red and blue strobe lights, pulled up onto the circular cobblestone driveway right outside the front doors. The disdain and the hidden empire. To understand why Genevieve Sterling felt entitled to erase my very identity at a family holiday dinner, you have to understand the toxic anatomy of institutional snobbery. My name is Dr. Evelyn Reed. I am 38 years old, and to the Sterling family, I was an invisible, uncultured zero. I was born in a small, improvised town in southern Ohio. My mother passed away from cancer when I was 12, and my father worked double shifts as a diesel mechanic for 30 years to ensure my brother and I had food, boots, and public school textbooks. We didn't have vacation homes. We didn't have trust funds. We have a tin roof house, a freezer stocked with cheap meat, and an unshakable belief that self-worth is forged through labor, intellect, and discipline. "Evelyn," my father used to tell me as we worked on engine blocks in our freezing garage, "never let a person in a silk suit make you feel small. Money only buys loud clothes and soft hands. It doesn't buy brains, guts, or character. Work hard in the dark, master your craft, and let the world try to ignore you when you're standing on the top of the mountain." I took my father's words and carved them into my reality. I won a full merit scholarship to Johns Hopkins University, completing my undergraduate degree in biochemistry in 3 years. I earned my doctorate in molecular engineering and immunology from Stanford, followed by a Master of Public Policy from Harvard. By the time I was 34, I was the chief executive officer and principal founder of Vance-Reed Bio-Technologies, a private, ultra-specialized strategic research conglomerate that held over 40 patents in advanced biosensors, emergency synthetic pharmaceuticals, and high-level medical logistics infrastructure. Because 90% of our operational contracts were executed directly with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, the Department of Defense, and the World Health Organization, under strict national security non-disclosure protocols, my company operated entirely in the shadows. I never gave glossy magazine interviews. I never appeared on cable news. I lived in a quiet, immaculate townhouse, drove a reliable domestic sedan, and directed a multi-billion-dollar private holding trust called Sovereign Aegis Group. 4 years ago, I met Richard Sterling. Richard was a senior project manager at Sterling Development Corp., a mid-sized commercial real estate firm founded by his late grandfather. When we first met at a regional green building summit in Boston, Richard seemed soft-spoken, thoughtful, and genuinely fascinated by environmental architecture. He was a stark contrast to the aggressive, ego-driven corporate men I typically dealt with in federal boardrooms. We started dating. I fell in love with the quiet, gentle man I believed him to be. However, I made a conscious choice early in our relationship to keep the true scale of my professional wealth and federal authority completely confidential. Richard knew I was a biomedical consultant who worked on government contracts, but he assumed I was merely a mid-level salary researcher making low six figures. I wanted a marriage built on genuine emotional connection, not a financial merger based on my massive balance sheets. The nightmare began the moment Richard introduced me to his family at Pinecrest Estate. The Sterlings projected an image of untouchable, elite aristocracy. They wore designer clothes, talked endlessly about their ancestral roots tracing back to the Mayflower, and treated service staff like disposable furniture. From the first night I sat in their drawing room, Genevieve Sterling made her intense hatred for me crystal clear. "So, Evelyn," Genevieve had sneered during our very first dinner, swirling her scotch, "Richard tells us your father was a mechanic? In Ohio? Goodness. Garage." Richard had cleared his throat nervously, looking at his lap. "Mom, Evelyn has a doctorate from Stanford." Genevieve had cut him off with a sharp glare. "A doctorate from a state-funded laboratory is hardly a replacement for good blood, Richard. She is a glorified laboratory technician." I didn't lose my temper. I didn't raise my voice. I smiled politely, took a sip of water, and allowed her to bask in her shallow illusions. Over the next 3 years of our marriage, Genevieve's disdain escalated from passive-aggressive comments into systematic, public degradation. At family gatherings, she intentionally omitted my name from printed event itineraries. When family portraits were taken at country club galas, she would loudly instruct the photographer, "Step to the side, girls. Let's get a shot of the real Sterlings without the hired help in the background." When Richard and I bought our home, Genevieve openly mocked our furniture, calling it cheap department store junk suitable for commoners. Worst of all was Richard's complete, spineless submission to his mother. Whenever Genevieve insulted me, Richard would pull me into the hallway and whisper, "Evelyn, please. Just let it go. You know how my mother is. She's old-fashioned. Just don't make a scene. We need to keep the peace so my trust fund distributions aren't delayed." He was a 36-year-old man paralyzed by the fear of losing his mother's approval and his family's money. What Genevieve and Richard did not know, what no one in the Sterling family knew, was that behind their grand facade of old money wealth, Sterling Development Corp. Was secretly standing on the verge of absolute, catastrophic financial collapse. 18 months before this Thanksgiving dinner, my financial team at Sovereign Aegis Group flagged a critical emergency signal in the regional commercial real estate market. Charles Sterling, Richard's father, and his older brother Julian had made a series of reckless, high-leverage gambles. They had taken out $45 million in high-interest private debt notes to construct a massive, luxury office complex in downtown Hartford, a project that was currently 80% vacant, bleeding $2 million a month in unpayable interest. To stave off immediate default, the Sterlings had quietly mortgaged Pinecrest Estate itself, along with every commercial property in their portfolio. They were drowning. They were entirely insolvent. They were weeks away from being forced into a public, devastating Chapter 11 bankruptcy that would strip them of their estate, their cars, their country club memberships, and their standing in high society. 6 months prior to Thanksgiving, my acquisition team at Sovereign Aegis quietly bought up 82% of Sterling Development Corp's defaulted mortgage debt from the primary banking syndicate. I didn't do it to destroy them. I did it because I intended to present the fully forgiven debt certificates to Richard on his upcoming birthday. A massive, life-altering gift to free his family from ruin and give him the confidence to finally stand on his own 2 feet. I wanted to see if my husband possessed a shred of moral integrity. I wanted to see if, when pushed to the absolute brink, Richard would step up and defend the woman he swore for love, or if he would remain a cowardly puppet to his mother's cruelty. Thanksgiving dinner at Pinecrest Estate was the final test, and Richard failed it beyond comprehension. The Thanksgiving dinner and the ultimate slight. The dining room at Pinecrest Estate was a spectacle of excessive, performative wealth. The walls were lined with oil paintings of sterling ancestors in gilded frames. The table was set with heirloom sterling silver from the 1890s, Waterford crystal glasses, and personalized hand-lettered place cards written in gold calligraphy for each guest. Except for me. When I had walked into the dining room at 6:30 evening wearing a simple, tailored navy wool dress, Genevieve had intercepted me near the door with a cold, mocking smirk. "Oh, you're here," Genevieve said, holding up 2 fingers to stop me. "We don't have room for you at the main table setting, dear. Senator Bradley and Vice President Adams of First National Bank are sitting near the center. We can't have you cluttering up the conversation with talk of lab work and Ohio farms." She gestured toward a small, wooden folding chair pushed into the dark corner near the service pantry door, right behind a massive marble pillar. "You can sit there," Genevieve added flatly. "And I have explicitly instructed the serving staff not to print a place card for you. In fact, I have informed the entire table that we will not be uttering your name tonight. It is an eyesore to our legacy." I had turned to Richard, who was standing nearby in his tuxedo, sipping a glass of vintage champagne. "Richard," I said softly, my voice perfectly calm, "your mother just placed me on a folding chair in the corner and prohibited the room from speaking my name. Are you really going to sit at the head table and allow this?" Richard had flushed bright red, sweating, looking around nervously to ensure no guests were listening. "Evelyn, Jesus Christ, keep your voice down," Richard hissed under his breath. "My mother is hosting the senator tonight. We are trying to secure a state infrastructure tax credit to save the company. Do you have any ideas how important tonight is for my family? Just sit in the chair, keep your mouth shut, and don't ruin this for us." "Don't ruin this for us," I repeated softly. Understood. I walked over to the wooden folding chair, sat down, pulled my encrypted corporate smartphone from my purse, and initiated a private text sequence to my chief legal officer, Marcus Vance, and my senior financial director, Elena Rostova. "Evelyn, execute Project Ironclad immediately. Transfer all holding documentation for the sterling debt portfolio to my primary command terminal. Prepare full foreclosure notices for Pinecrest Estate. Marcus, execution confirmed. Director Reed. The Federal Task Force convoy is en route to your location, with the master strategic papers for the Federal Emergency Infrastructure Board appointment. ETA 15 minutes. I placed the phone back in my clutch purse, sat back in my wooden folding chair, and watched the performance unfold. The dinner was an excruciating display of vanity and despair. Throughout the 4-course meal, Charles Sterling and Julian Sterling hovered around Senator Bradley and Bank Vice President Adams, practically begging for loan extensions and state assistance. Genevieve held court at the center of the table, loudly boasting about the Sterling family's long history of philanthropy, corporate power, and societal purity. Not a single guest at the main table looked toward my corner. Whenever a waiter brought a dish near my chair, Genevieve would bark across the room, "Don't waste the good dark meat on that section. Just give it the leftover roll." When Julian's wife accidentally asked me to pass the gravy boat, calling out, "Evelyn, could you?" Genevieve slammed her champagne glass down onto the table with a sharp crack. "Julian, control your wife," Genevieve snapped loudly, her voice echoing off the high ceiling. "We don't say that name in this house. If she wants the gravy passed, she can refer to the person in the corner." The room fell into an awkward, painful silence. Julian's wife turned pale, lowering her head. Richard sat right beside his mother, smiling sheepishly, cutting his turkey, completely silent, completely spineless. At 8 o'clock, the dessert plates were cleared away. The waiters poured 22 glasses of rare 50-year-old port wine. Genevieve stood up at the head of the table, holding her glass high, tapping it with a silver spoon to capture the room's attention. Distinguished guests, family, and honored friends, Genevieve began, her voice dripping with aristocratic theatricality. On this night of Thanksgiving, it is our custom to reflect on what makes the Sterling family great. It is our absolute refusal to compromise on excellence, bloodline, and dignity. She paused, turning her head slowly to look past the marble pillar, targeting my folding chair with eyes full of pure toxicity. We have faced trials this year, Genevieve declared loudly. We have outside elements trying to slide their way into our orbit. Low-class nobodies from backward towns who thought they could use my son to elevate their pathetic lives. But tonight, I want to make it officially clear to everyone present, that person sitting on the folding chair is not a Sterling. She will never be a Sterling. She has no standing, no pedigree, no name, and no future in this estate. Genevieve raised her glass higher. So let us raise a glass to the true Sterlings. May our legacy remain pure, untouchable, and forever dominant. The high society guests hesitated, sensing the extreme, unhinged malice in the room, but several corporate board members slowly raised their glasses to appease Genevieve. I stood up from my wooden folding chair. The motion was so smooth, so quiet, that the entire room turned to look at me. I walked out from behind the marble pillar, stepping onto the Persian rug in the center of the dining room. Genevieve, I said, my voice low, clear, and perfectly composed, carrying through the quiet room like a bell. Genevieve sneered, setting her glass down hard. How dare you speak without permission? I told you, you don't have a voice at this table. Sit back down. I am curious, Genevieve, I continued, taking a step closer to the main table. You talk constantly about legacy, purity, and dominant status. But tell me, does legacy really involve hiding $45 million of defaulted bank debt from the IRS? Charles Sterling choked on his port wine, coughing violently, his face turning bright purple. What? Does generational dignity include mortgaging Pinecrest Estate to a private syndicate just to pay your country club dues this month? I asked, taking another step forward. Or taking out high-interest emergency loans to stop the county sheriff from posting a public auction sign on your front gate? Julian Sterling stood up so fast he knocked his dining chair backward onto the floor. How the hell do you know about that? Richard looked at me in absolute panicked confusion. Evelyn, what are you talking about? Shut up! You're ruining everything! I don't have a name in this house, Richard, I said, looking at my husband with cold pity. So why should I keep your secrets? Before Genevieve could scream for security, the deep, rumbling roar of heavy diesel engines shook the window panes of the dining room. Outside, high-intensity lights swept across the high-arched windows as 3 massive black vehicles came to a stop on the circular driveway outside. Heavy boots slammed onto the stone porch, and seconds later, the grand front entrance doors of Pinecrest Estate were thrown open with a thunderous bang. The black SUV, the reveal. The heavy thud of tactical boots against the marble foyer floor echoed straight into the formal dining room. 4 armed Federal Protective Services officers dressed in tactical dress uniforms with gold crests stood guard at the entrance of the dining room, securing the perimeter. Walking briskly into the dining room came 3 high-ranking officials. At the lead was Admiral Christopher Thorne, the director of the National Strategic Reserve and a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, dressed in his full military white dress covered in ribbons. Walking alongside him was Cabinet Secretary Jonathan Vance from the Department of Health and Human Services. Trailing directly behind them was my Chief Legal Officer, Marcus Vance, holding a gold-embossed executive courier case. Genevieve's jaw dropped. Her face turned from flushed red to an ash-gray slate. Charles Sterling rapidly buttoned his tuxedo jacket, gasping for air, stumbling down the dining room floor toward the entrance. Secretary Vance! Admiral Thorne! Charles stammered, his voice trembling with desperate, frantic servility. What an absolute honor! We had no idea the Federal Executive Board was visiting Greenwich. Please, come right to the head table. We have 50-year port wine waiting. Secretary Vance didn't even look at Charles's outstretched hand. He pushed right past him as if Charles were a piece of trash on the rug, his sharp eyes sweeping across the room. Where is Dr. Evelyn Reed? Secretary Vance's deep, commanding voice boomed through the high-ceilinged room. Charles stopped dead in his tracks, blinking in complete, uncomprehending shock. Who? Evelyn? My son's wife? She's just a junior lab worker sitting in the corner. Admiral Thorne stepped forward, glaring down at Charles with military disdain. Junior lab worker? Mr. Sterling, Dr. Evelyn Reed is the Chief Executive Officer of Vance-Reed Bio-Technologies and the newly appointed Federal Director of National Biodefense Infrastructure. A collective, violent gasp erupted across the 22 high society guests. Bank Vice President Adams stood up so quickly his water glass overturned. Senator Bradley stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. Richard's head snapped toward me, his face completely drained of blood, his lips trembling violently. "Evelyn, you own Vance-Reed?" Genevieve staggered backwards, clutching her Mikimoto pearls, her voice shaking with panicked denial. No, that's impossible. She's from an obscure farm in Ohio. Her father was a mechanic. She's a nobody. She's lying to you." Marcus Vance, my legal counsel, stepped forward, opened his leather courier case, pulled out a stack of heavy legal documents stamped with red federal seals. "Mrs. Sterling," Marcus declared loudly, his voice echoing across the silent hall, "Dr. Reed's private holding trust, Sovereign Aegis Group, holds over $2 billion in liquid capital. Furthermore, 6 months ago, Dr. Reed personally authorized the acquisition of Sterling Development Corp's defaulted debt portfolio." Marcus pulled out a master foreclosing document. "As of 7 o'clock tonight," Marcus continued, "Sovereign Aegis Group owns $45 million of primary secured mortgage notes on Sterling Development Corp. That includes the mortgage on this estate, your corporate headquarters, and your commercial properties." Charles Sterling collapsed backward onto the dining table, knocking over a crystal vase, gasping for breath as if he were suffering a cardiac event. She owns our debt?" "She doesn't just own your debt, Mr. Sterling," Marcus added coldly. "You have defaulted on 3 consecutive interest payments. 20 minutes ago, Dr. Reed signed the final legal execution papers." Secretary Vance walked straight over to me, stopped 2 feet away, brought his heels together, and offered a deep, formal nod of executive respect. "Director Reed," Secretary Vance said formally, handing me a leather-bound presidential appointment binder. "The President and the Senate Finance Committee have officially ratified your Master Federal Infrastructure Directive. We require your final signature to initiate the $3 billion National Logistics Program." "Thank you, Secretary Vance," I said calmly, taking my fountain pen, signing my name across the primary execution pages, and handing the binder back to him. "Contract finalized, Director," Vance replied, taking the binder. He turned his head slowly, looking at the small wooden folding chair tucked behind the marble pillar, and then looked at Genevieve, who was shaking so hard she had to lean against a server's tray to stay standing. "Director Reed," Secretary Vance asked, his voice dripping with lethal curiosity, "why were you sitting on a wooden lawn chair in the corner of this dining room?" I stood in the center of the Persian rug, looking at the gathering of high society elites, my voice cold, steady, and clear. "Because, Secretary Vance," I said, "my mother-in-law, Genevieve Sterling, just informed this room that because I came from a working-class family in Ohio, I am a nameless, cheap interloper. She explicitly instructed every guest at this table that my name was forbidden from being spoken in this house." A suffocating, agonizing silence fell over Pinecrest Estate. The high society guests who had spent the evening flattering Genevieve began pulling back in utter horror. Senator Bradley immediately gathered his coat, looking at Charles Sterling with pure disgust. "Charles, you told me your family was financially secure. You brought me to a house owned by the Federal Director of Biodefense while insulting her to her face? We are done." Secretary Vance looked at Genevieve, his eyes turning to absolute ice. "Is that so?" Vance said softly. "Well, Mrs. Sterling, I suggest you get used to speaking her title, because effective at 9 o'clock tonight, Sovereign Aegis Group has initiated non-judicial foreclosure proceedings on Pinecrest Estate." Genevieve lets out a high-pitched, hysterical shriek. "Foreclosure? You can't foreclose on Pinecrest Estate. My family has lived here for 40 years. It's an ancestral landmark." "Your family lived here," I said, stepping forward, looking down at her with unshakable authority. "But your arrogance, your unpayable debts, and your complete lack of character destroyed it. You don't own Pinecrest Estate anymore, Genevieve. My holding trust owns it." Richard frantically pushed his way past the table, staggering over to me, grabbing his hair in pure, unadulterated panic. "Evelyn! Evelyn, please!" Richard begged, his voice cracking, tears streaming down his face as he dropped to his knees right there on the dining room rug in front of everyone. "Evelyn, I didn't know. I swear to God I didn't know you owned Sovereign Aegis. I love you. Please don't do this to my family. Please forgive my mother. She didn't mean it. We can fix our marriage. I'll never listen to her again." I looked down at Richard as he kneeled at my feet, weeping, begging not for me, not for our love, but for his family's money, status, and luxury estate. "Stand up, Richard," I said coldly. He scrambled to his feet, holding his hands out like a desperate child. "Evelyn, please." I pulled my platinum diamond wedding band from my finger. I held it up for a second, looked at it, and then dropped it right into his glass of vintage port wine sitting on the table beside him. It sank to the bottom with a small, heavy thud. "I didn't keep my career a secret to trick you, Richard," I said, my voice filled with steady, unshakable finality. "I kept it quiet, because I wanted a husband who loved me, for whom I was, when the world wasn't looking. I wanted a man who had the spine, the honor, and the character to stand up for his wife against cruelty. But you aren't a man. You're just a cowardly child who let his mother insult the woman who built everything." I turned to Genevieve, who was standing frozen in shock. "You refused to say my name tonight, Genevieve," I said flatly. "So remember it now. Dr. Evelyn Reed, my legal team is serving your formal 24-hour eviction notice at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. Start packing." Without waiting for another word, I turned my back on the Sterling family, turned my back on Richard, and walked out of the grand dining room. Behind me, the sound of Genevieve wailing in absolute terror, Charles collapsing into his chair, and Richard screaming my name echoed through the high ceilings of Pinecrest Estate. I stepped out through the front entrance, into the crisp, cool night air, and stepped into the back of the black federal suburb. The reckoning and the new horizon. The aftermath of that Thanksgiving dinner at Pinecrest Estate was swift, absolute, and completely catastrophic for the Sterling family. In the worlds of high finance, corporate real estate, and state politics, news travels like wildfire. By sunrise the next morning, every bank, investor, and country club board member in Connecticut knew the full, humiliating story. First National Bank instantly froze Sterling Development Corp's remaining lines of credit, realizing the company was completely insolvent. Within 10 days, Sterling Development Corp filed for emergency Chapter 11 bankruptcy liquidation. During the court-ordered asset sale, Sovereign Aegis Group enforced its primary secured debt rights. We seized Pinecrest Estate, their corporate headquarters, and their commercial developments. The commercial properties were immediately repurposed into regional research centers for Vance-Reed Bio-Technologies, creating 600 high-paying scientific jobs for local university graduates. As for Pinecrest Estate itself, I have zero interest in living in a mansion built on arrogance. I donated the entire 40-acre property to a National Veterans Medical Foundation, transforming the luxury estate into a world-class recovery center for wounded military service members and their families, turning a place of snobbery into a sanctuary of healing and honor. The personal collapse of the Sterlings was complete. Genevieve Sterling was forced to sell her jewelry, designer wardrobe, and vintage automobiles to cover personal legal debts and back taxes. Stripped of her high society status, her country club access, and her grand home, she was forced to move into a small, two-bedroom rental apartment in an unfamiliar town, completely abandoned by the socialite friends who had once cheered on her cruelty. Richard called me dozens of times in the months following the dinner. He sent frantic emails, wrote handwritten letters, and even showed up at my corporate headquarters lobby, begging for 5 minutes to explain himself, swearing that he had cut his mother out of his life forever, promising that he would do anything for a second chance. I never took his calls. I never responded to his letters. I had corporate security escort him from the premises. Richard was eventually forced to take an entry-level property management job in a small Midwestern town, earning a modest salary, far away from the elite circles he had spent his life clinging to. 8 months after that night, I sat at the head of a massive mahogany conference table in Vance-Reed's new global command tower overlooking the harbor. Outside my floor-to-ceiling windows, research vessels moved smoothly through the water, and scientific teams operated in state-of-the-art laboratories below. a living testament to real work, intellect, and discipline. My assistant walked into the room, setting a fresh cup of coffee on my desk, along with a small, framed photograph that had arrived in the morning mail. It was a photograph of my father, standing in front of his old garage in Ohio, wearing his clean work uniform, holding a wrench, smiling with quiet, unshakable pride. I looked at the photograph, then looked out over the harbor. I thought about Genevieve Sterling's rule that night, her absolute refusal to utter my name. I then realized that Genevieve had given me a strange gift. She had forced the truth into the light before I spent another year tied to a spineless man and a hollow family. True human worth has never been measured by gold-lettered place cards, ancestral names, silk dresses, or old money estates. Real strength is quiet. It is built in the dark through hard labor, relentless discipline, and unshakable character. The people who spend their lives looking down on others to feel big are almost always the ones standing on the foundations of sand, and when the tide comes in, they fall first, hardest, and fastest. I picked up my pen, turned to the strategic biodefense blueprints spread across my desk, and went back to work. Leave the word respect in the comments right now if you believe that true human worth is proven through honest hard work, character, and discipline, never through arrogant status, old money, or putting others down. Arrogance always demands an audience, but true capability operates in silence until the work is finished. And if this story reminds you to never let anyone make you feel small because of where you came from, hit that subscribe button right now, because tomorrow, I am bringing you the unbelievable story of a quiet hospital nurse who was publicly fired and mocked by a wealthy chief surgeon, only for a 4-star military convoy to pull up to the emergency room 3 hours later to appoint her as the new regional health commissioner. I'll see you in the next story.